Gene Hackman had a secret tunnel running beneath his property, and what DNA analysis uncovered inside it is specifically bad news for him. Not for his reputation, not for the way the public chooses to remember him, but for him personally, for the decisions he made, and for what federal investigators can now demonstrate he was deliberately carrying out in the years leading up to his death. The DNA results triggered an immediate national security classification. The case was removed from standard investigative channels within hours. And once you understand what the biological material found inside that tunnel actually confirmed about Hackman's conduct, not merely the tunnel's existence, but what he knew, what he chose to do, and what he kept concealed, the story stops feeling like a mystery. It becomes a verdict. When Gene Hackman passed away at his $4 million Santa Fe estate in New Mexico, the official explanation seemed to write itself. He was 95 years old. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, had already died. An elderly man, alone in his grief, pulling away from the world until his body simply gave out. Betsy's cause of death was attributed to a severe viral infection. Gene's was listed as heart failure. The story was clean. It was human. And it was wrong. For most people watching, even the immediate arrival of federal agents at the estate barely raised an eyebrow. A man of Hackman's wealth and public stature warranted careful procedural handling, didn't he? The FBI presence was folded into the logic of standard protocol applied whenever high-profile estates change hands unexpectedly. The heavy steel gates, the motion detectors ringing the entire property, the thermal cameras positioned at measured intervals along the perimeter walls. All of it read as the expected quirks of a Hollywood legend who had spent decades managing unwanted attention. The non-disclosure agreements legally binding every person ever employed on the estate seemed reasonable, private, entirely understandable, and that is precisely what made the cover so effective. The estate itself maintained the illusion perfectly. It sat behind thick stone walls, completely cut off from the surrounding road network. Decades of deliberate withdrawal had made every defensive measure seem ordinary. By the time Hackman had fully stepped away from public life, the compound felt less like a celebrity hideaway and more like a controlled perimeter. No one passing by ever gave it a second thought. That outcome was entirely intentional. Here is where the explanations start to fall apart. When the first federal forensics team stepped through the front door, they were not walking into the quiet aftermath of a peaceful death. They were entering a scene that had been deliberately managed. And the moment they reconstructed the behavioral timeline, the real one, rebuilt from security server records, every tidy assumption they had carried in began to crumble. Betsy Arakawa died a full 7 days before Gene Hackman, 7 days during which the estate's entire telecommunication system logged 0 outgoing calls, no emergency services, no family members, no medical contact of any kind. For 7 days, a 95-year-old man with documented heart disease sat alone inside a sealed compound alongside his wife's body and never once picked up a phone. Investigators retrieved the central security server data from the ground floor. What they found bore no resemblance to the disorganized record of a man undone by grief. Bedroom furniture had been pulled away from its original positions. Personal safes had been forced open. And on the very day Betsy died, Gene Hackman had manually keyed in the code to disable every internal surveillance camera on the property while simultaneously locking the outer perimeter alarms at their highest sensitivity setting. That configuration is not panic. That is architecture. The deliberate blinding of one system alongside the calculated preservation of another. An arrangement made by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and precisely what they needed to hide. Behavioral analysts brought in to review the security data were unequivocal. This was not emotional disorientation. The unmistakable signature of a deliberate containment process was written all over it, one engineered to blind the internal environment while keeping the outer barrier running at full strength. This detail carries real weight because of what the federal forensic record would go on to confirm. It is the first hard proof that what unfolded at that estate was not accidental, it was a choice. Gene Hackman made a series of deliberate, knowing decisions to maintain and protect something buried beneath that property. The DNA analysis and the microforensic abrasion evidence establish the physical reality of those decisions beyond question. That is precisely what makes this so damaging for him personally. The evidence does not paint a picture of a man overtaken by circumstances outside his control. It describes someone who knew exactly what he was guarding and chose, repeatedly, right up until the very end, to keep guarding it. What LAR uncovered in the bedrock forced federal agents to go further, literally. LAR scanning equipment and thermal imaging arrays were deployed across every inch of the Santa Fe property. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, operates by firing high-speed laser pulses at surfaces and measuring the time it takes for those pulses to return, constructing precise three-dimensional maps of hidden voids beneath any structure without so much as disturbing the ground above. It is the same technology used to discover ancient cities buried under dense jungle canopy. Here, it was pointed downward through the floors of a dead man's house. On the very first scan pass, the system flagged a deep temperature anomaly. It ran from behind the wall of Gene Hackman's private library, dropping through dozens of meters of solid New Mexico bedrock. Agents cross-referenced the finding against county civil planning records. What they discovered, or rather, what they could not find, confirmed that anomaly as something far more serious. The underground structure LiDAR had just mapped in perfect three-dimensional detail did not appear anywhere in any civil planning record on file with the county. It had never been registered. It had never been disclosed. As far as any official document was concerned, it simply did not exist. The entrance was hidden behind a bookshelf. That detail alone would invite skepticism if the mechanism concealing it were not so deliberately, almost brutally, functional. There was no biometric scanner, no electronic switch, no wireless signal of any kind. What secured that passage was a complex mechanical locking system built directly into wood and steel, a precise sequence of physical actions that had to be carried out entirely by hand, requiring considerable force to disengage solid steel bolts embedded in the frame. The design philosophy was deliberate and specific, a system that produces no radio frequency signature, a system that keeps working through a complete power failure, a system immune to remote monitoring, accidental triggering, and detection by electronic scanning equipment. Whoever built this entrance constructed it for permanence, for secrecy, and for resilience, under conditions most people would never even think to prepare for. Agents stepped through and descended. The upper section of the tunnel, nearest to ground level, was reinforced with poured concrete and heavy steel beams. Dr. Marcus Elford, a structural engineer attached to the Federal Forensic Response Team, studied the rivet spacing and went silent for several seconds before he spoke. The spacing and pouring method matched military-grade security construction standards dating back to the 1950s. Exactly. He told the lead investigator that across 30 years of structural assessment work, he had come across that specific rivet configuration in only 2 other places. Both were classified federal installations, but at a depth of 40 feet, everything shifted. The industrial concrete ended. The steel beams vanished. What replaced them were rough stone walls carved with thousands of marks left by primitive tools. The air quality in the lower section revealed something deeply unsettling: unnatural shifts in thermal gradients, abrupt changes in humidity, and a heavy concentration of oxidized metallic particles hanging suspended in the air. The kind of chemical signature produced by prolonged contact with materials and processes that had absolutely no reason to exist inside a sealed, natural cave. The hand-carved stone core running through this tunnel was not something built in modern times. It was part of an ancient artificial geological structure shaped by human hands long before the military upper section was constructed above it and long before the estate itself was ever placed on that land. Whatever original purpose this tunnel had once served, it came before the 1950s construction that buried it from view. It came before the estate. It may have come before anyone currently living who even knew it existed. This was not a bunker with an older section tucked inside it. It was an ancient structure that had been reinforced, weaponized, and concealed beneath a private estate with the clear and deliberate intention that nobody on the outside would ever locate it. What the DNA confirmed, the dust samples pulled from the tunnel's mechanical locking mechanism told a story that sent the entire death investigation veering off in a new direction. Special forensic technician Raymond Voss, attached to the federal evidence team operating out of the Albuquerque field office, was the first analyst to examine the interior gears of the locking system under magnification. His instructions were to look for anything inconsistent with extended disuse. What he discovered instead caused him to put down his instruments and phone his supervisor before committing a single word to his report. The metallic abrasion marks covering the interior gears were fresh. Not months old, not years old, days old, lining up with forensic precision to the 7-day window separating Betsy Arakawa's death from Gene Hackman's. The implication was impossible to avoid. A 95-year-old man in the final documented stages of cardiac decline had not spent his last days lying in bed. He had gone down into that tunnel. He had worked those heavy mechanical locks. He had descended into the cold subterranean dark at some point across those 7 final days, and then returned to the surface before collapsing for the last time. But it was the DNA analysis drawn from organic material collected deeper inside the tunnel that shifted the character of the investigation entirely and produced findings that federal authorities moved without hesitation to classify. What the DNA testing uncovered was not evidence of casual occupation or straightforward long-term storage. The genetic material recovered from the deepest sections of the underground chamber pointed to exposure to biological conditions that simply should not exist in an isolated subterranean space beneath a private estate in Santa Fe. The specific classification of what was identified has never been publicly released. What has been confirmed through sources close to the original forensic team is the following. The DNA findings triggered an immediate escalation of the federal response. The case was pulled from standard investigative channels and redirected through classification protocols that are typically reserved for matters involving active national security infrastructure. Not historical curiosity, active ongoing concern. The organic material discovered in that chamber had no innocent explanation to offer. Its presence confirmed that the tunnel had not been sitting dormant. Something biological, something capable of leaving recoverable DNA trace evidence had been active within that space, and the individuals holding the authority to classify that finding decided within hours of receiving it that the public had no need to know what it was. Whatever Gene Hackman had been doing inside that tunnel, whatever he had been watching over and protecting, carried significance at a state level that reached far beyond the private decisions of a retired actor living quietly out in the New Mexico desert. A timeline that simply cannot be explained away. The DNA findings did not stand alone. They slotted directly into a physical timeline that investigators had already been struggling to make sense of. Consider what the security data had established even before the DNA results came in. Betsy Arakawa dies that very same day. Gene Hackman disables every internal surveillance camera on the estate while keeping the perimeter alarms locked at their highest setting. 7 days go by without a single point of contact with the outside world. Raymond Voss's micro-scale forensic examination of the mechanical lock system confirms the tunnel was entered during that period. And now, the DNA analysis of material recovered from the lowest point of the underground chamber confirms biological activity that simply cannot be explained by long-term dormancy. Any one of these data points, taken on its own, could theoretically be brushed aside. A man switching off his cameras in the early hours of grief. An elderly man, perhaps disoriented, descending stairs he had no business on. DNA contamination from decades of human presence. But when you stack them all together in sequence, those explanations fall apart because every single one of them points in the same direction, toward a man who, in the final days of his life with a deteriorating heart, was carrying out specific tasks in a specific order, not randomly, not emotionally, with the methodical, deliberate precision of someone executing a protocol they had followed many times before. This is the detail that initial coverage missed completely. When investigators show up to the scene of a confused old man's accidental death, they do not immediately move to classify the forensic results. They do not bring in signal shielding equipment under the cover of darkness. They do not place national security holds on municipal complaint records going back to 2019. The speed and shape of the government's response tells you far more about what was actually discovered than any official press release ever could. And the DNA results were not the only biological anomaly flagged from inside that chamber. Atmospheric samples pulled from the deepest section of the tunnel showed chemical compounds tied to active organic metabolic processes, not ancient residue, not geological byproduct, but active compounds generated by living biological systems. That finding was folded into the same classification order as the DNA analysis. Both were sealed within the same 12-hour window, the chamber at the bottom. When the full investigation team finally reached the base of the tunnel, they stepped into a space that dismantled every framework they had walked in with. The natural stone floor had been deliberately flattened and leveled. Its surface was carved with an intricate system of astronomical coordinates, a precise mapping of planetary orbits that pointed to a level of advanced mathematical understanding, completely at odds with any casual private use. Wooden crates were spread across the floor and held metallurgical components of unknown origin. Many had been cast as single, solid pieces with no welding seams anywhere, a manufacturing approach with no parallel in any documented industrial metalwork from the early 20th century, but none of that was what stopped the room cold. Fixed along the rough stone wall, held in place with corrosion-resistant metal brackets, was a closed-circuit communication system. A thick, coaxial cable, wrapped in dense industrial rubber insulation, passed directly through the wall above and cut through dozens of meters of solid bedrock before ending in the heart of the underground chamber. Electrical systems analyst Dr. Claire Souza, on secondment from a federal infrastructure assessment unit, was brought in to evaluate the circuit. She confirmed on record that this was no leftover relic from an old renovation. Tracing the power source, she uncovered a localized alkaline battery array operating in complete independence from the estate's electrical grid, above, sized, and configured to run without interruption, even through a total surface power failure. She told colleagues it was among the most deliberately engineered pieces of electrical infrastructure she had ever evaluated outside of a classified facility. The system was active. Its protective casing showed unmistakable signs of regular cleaning and careful maintenance carried out with consistent attention to counteract the humidity levels present in the cavern. When Souza pulled apart the physical connectors to examine the interior, she found no microphone, no speaker, no mechanism for voice transmission of any kind in either direction. The cable ended at a large mechanical signal transducer, a device with one single purpose: to be pressed firmly against solid surfaces and pick up extremely low-frequency vibrations. Tiny fluctuations in pressure, subtle movements traveling through the thick stone walls, were converted into electrical signals and sent upward through a buried cable directly to a hidden monitoring speaker inside Gene Hackman's private living quarters on the floor above. For an unknown stretch of years, Gene Hackman had not simply been residing on that estate. He had been posted there, listening, not to voices, not to radio broadcasts, not to anything from the outside world, but to the vibrations of whatever was pushing against the far side of a sealed wall 40 feet beneath his bedroom floor. At the far end of that analog cable, bonded to the deepest structure at the most distant wall of the chamber, where the cavern narrowed into an unnatural bottleneck, stood a massive iron door. It was not constructed from modern ballistic-grade materials. It was carbon steel, worn by considerable age, entirely flat. No external handle, no mechanical lock, no electronic keypad, no visible hinges on either face. Every seam along its edges, every point where the door met the natural stone frame surrounding it, had been sealed with continuous weld lines, unbroken, permanent, applied entirely from the outside. This is the single detail that shattered the entire investigative framework. A bunker door is designed to shield those inside from intrusion. The handle, the bolt, the locking mechanism, all of it exists so the people on the inside stay in control. They can open it whenever they choose. They can walk out, but a door welded permanently shut from the exterior with no mechanism whatsoever on either face operates according to a completely different logic. It is not a door built to protect. It is a door built to contain, to seal, to guarantee that whatever exists on the other side remains there permanently and without exception. When this one detail reached the federal investigators, it flipped the entire story of the estate above on its head. The towering stone perimeter walls, the strict confidentiality agreements that scrubbed every employee from any public record, the complete disconnection from surrounding road and utility infrastructure, Gene Hackman's deliberate disabling of his own internal surveillance cameras in the hours after his wife's death, all of it assembled together in the context of that welded steel door read entirely differently. Not one of those measures looks like the privacy habits of a famous man worn down by cameras and public attention. He was not shielding himself from the world. He was shielding the world from whatever lived on the other side of that sealed barrier. For years, possibly across the final 2 full decades of his life, Gene Hackman had served as the sole civilian guardian of a geological containment structure, using the estate's perimeter defenses to block any accidental access to the tunnel entrance, relying on the analog cable and the monitoring speaker to continuously track the pressure, the rhythm, and the vibrations of whatever the iron door was holding back, confirming day after day that the physical seal had not been broken. The true weight of what he had been carrying alone became most apparent in what the federal authorities did next. They had plasma-cutting equipment on site, industrial-grade tools capable of cutting through any steel structure within minutes. Not a single agent present was cleared to switch it on. National security specialists stood before that rusted door, studied the weld lines, documented the astronomical star map carved into the floor, and arrived at one decision. Everything stays sealed. The barrier does not get breached. They refuse to open what one man had spent his entire life keeping shut. The information was locked down immediately. The moment technical reports describing the welded door, the listening cable, and the classified DNA findings arrived at Central Command, all evidence collection at the site was brought to a complete halt. A total information lockdown was imposed. Not a single piece of forensic documentation was released to the press. Local journalists who tried to get close to the perimeter were pushed back by military police. Control of the surrounding woodland was transferred to special government authority, justified through emergency national security provisions. Every Freedom of Information Act request seeking the facility's structural blueprints was rejected under the highest classification protocols available. And then the data erasure came to light. Independent researchers attempting to pull up municipal records discovered that complaints filed by residents between 2019 and the present, submitted by people living several miles from the estate, had been methodically wiped from every state database accessible to civilian investigators. Those complaints had described a recurring low-frequency mechanical vibration rising from underground, occurring with regularity at roughly 2 in the morning. Civilian seismic monitoring equipment had captured these disturbances at the time. Local officials had dismissed them in writing as interference from public plumbing or underground heating systems. Those records no longer existed anywhere in the state system. The unmarked military transport convoys that reached the property under the cover of darkness in the days following the estate's discovery were carrying signal shielding equipment. Their movements bore absolutely no resemblance to an archaeological dig or a standard federal forensics operation. What was unfolding was the coordinated rotation of a risk management apparatus that had clearly existed in some capacity for a very long time, one that already knew what lay beneath and had simply been waiting for the right moment to step back in. When the physical evidence is considered as a whole, it points toward a deeply troubling conclusion. Some powerful and invisible authority had long been aware of the tunnel, the chamber, the containment door, and the listening system. They did not treat any of it as a new discovery. They moved to reclaim it as an existing asset, one they had apparently allowed a single civilian to maintain, fund, and guard entirely at his own expense for decades, while they remained conveniently invisible in the background. Only once the last watchman finally collapsed did they surface to take back what they had been watching over all along. And here is the question nobody in the early press coverage thought to ask. If Gene Hackman had genuinely been operating alone, if this was nothing more than the private fixation of an eccentric old man, why did the federal government already have a classified response protocol ready to go? Why were plasma cutting teams pre-authorized to be on site but forbidden from using their equipment? Why was a Freedom of Information Act denial issued within hours of the first requests under a classification tier that requires sign-off from a national security clearance chain that simply does not act on short notice? The speed of that response does not describe a government stumbling onto something unexpected. It describes a government managing a known situation that had suddenly become visible to the public. When the final 7 days are examined, when the micro-forensic evidence, the signal transmission data, the classified DNA findings, and the sealed welded door are all considered together, Gene Hackman's silence during the 7 days following Betsy's death stops being explainable as grief, shock, or psychological breakdown. It was a security protocol carried out to its absolute limit by a man who understood with precision what failure would cost. The moment Betsy drew her last breath, Hackman's deteriorating heart was faced with a merciless calculation. A single emergency call would have set off an unstoppable chain reaction. Local police, first responders, forensic teams, journalists, people with no knowledge of the containment protocols, no awareness of the tunnel, no understanding of what was sealed 40 feet below the library floor. They would move through the corridors. They would search every room, and they would inevitably find the bookshelf. An ordinary human curiosity, not malice, simply the instinct of investigators carrying out their duties, could have disrupted the mechanical locking sequence, cut the signal line, or drawn unwanted attention directly to that iron door and whatever waited behind it. So he made a decision. He switched off the internal surveillance cameras, making certain no record of his final movements could ever be retrieved. He descended those stone steps for the very last time. He worked the heavy mechanical locks, confirming the containment was still holding. He climbed back to the surface and settled inside the sealed, silent house, where the monitoring speaker in his private quarters continued transmitting that low-frequency rhythm rising up from the bedrock far below. He sat there and listened until his own heartbeat quietly ceased. The Santa Fe incident was closed, without any public explanation whatsoever. The unusual engineering structures, the astronomical coordinates, the classified DNA results, the active analog monitoring circuit, none of it was ever going to find resolution through a standard investigation. It was managed, transferred, and buried a second time. Only this time, it was buried beneath layers of classification protocol rather than solid bedrock. Authority passed from the trembling hands of one elderly civilian into the silent, calculated machinery of a government apparatus that had apparently never truly stepped away. The agents pulled back. The LiDAR equipment was packed up and carried off. The estate vanished from any publicly accessible record. Beneath the bedrock, the corroded iron door still stands, its welds fully intact and unbroken. And deep below the surface of the Santa Fe desert, far beyond the reach of ordinary human perception, that low-frequency vibration keeps up its mechanical rhythm, exactly as it did during the years when Gene Hackman was alive and present to hear it. Whatever he devoted an entire lifetime to listening for is still down there. Only the listener himself has been replaced. If this story left you with more questions than answers, that's precisely how it should be. Subscribe for more investigations that travel where the official record simply runs out.